The alarm went off at 4:47 a.m., same as it had every single morning for the past 31 years. Earl Buck Calloway didn't need it anymore. His body had long since stopped requiring the reminder. He was already awake, lying flat on his back in the dark, staring at the water stain on the bedroom ceiling, the one shaped vaguely like the state of Nebraska, listening to the silence of the Kansas plains before the world remembered it existed. He swung his legs off the side of the bed, wincing as his left knee announced itself the way it always did. A sharp, grinding protest that traveled from the joint up through his hip and settled somewhere in the middle of his lower back. 58 years old, and every morning felt like the body was filing a formal complaint. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he crossed to the window. Outside, the land was still black, but the horizon to the east showed the faintest suggestion of gray, the sky preparing itself. Reluctant and slow, the way an old dog rises from a warm spot. 42 acres stretched out beyond the glass, and even in the dark, Buck knew every inch of it. Every low spot where water pooled after a storm. Every rocky patch near the north fence where the soil thinned out and fought back against the plow. Every row of the winter wheat that had gone in 6 weeks ago, sitting now in the frozen ground waiting for spring with the patience that only things rooted in the earth truly understood. He pulled on his work jeans, stiff with dried mud at the knees, and a thermal undershirt. Then a faded flannel shirt the color of old brick. His boots were by the back door where they always were, caked at the soles with the particular dark clay of Harding County, Kansas. He laced them slowly, sitting on the wooden bench his father had built from scrap lumber in 1971. The bench was worn smooth at the seat, the wood darkened by decades of the same morning ritual. Coffee first. Always coffee first. The kitchen was cold. The old propane furnace took its time in the mornings, and Buck had never bothered to turn the thermostat up past 62 at night. Waste of money, he figured. He filled the percolator, a stainless steel relic from the 1980s that his late wife, Margaret, had once called an embarrassment and that he'd refused to replace on principle, and set it on the burner. While it heated, he stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard. His tractor sat in the open-sided equipment shed 20 yards from the house. A 1987 John Deere 4250. Green paint faded to the color of old moss, rust collecting in the wheel wells and along the lower frame rails. The cab had a crack in the rear window that he'd sealed 3 winters ago with a strip of weatherproofing tape that had since dried and begun to peel at the corners. The left front tire had been replaced 2 years back, the only new part on the machine in the last decade. He'd done the work himself, lying in the gravel with a hydraulic jack and a socket set, cursing for 40 minutes straight before the lug nuts finally surrendered. People had been making comments about that tractor for years. "When are you gonna get a real machine, Buck? My God, Calloway, you still running that dinosaur? I'll give you $200 for it, as scrap metal." That last one had come from Dale Pritchard, who farmed the 800 acres just north of Buck's property and who had purchased, 2 years ago, a brand new John Deere 8R410 with GPS-guided auto-steer, variable rate seating technology, and a cab that looked like the cockpit of a commercial airliner. The machine had cost $420,000. Dale had financed it through a deal with Agravance Capital, one of the investment firms that had been moving through rural Kansas like a slow tide, buying up debt and land with the calm efficiency of something that felt no urgency and experienced no doubt. Buck had stood in Dale's equipment barn the day the new tractor arrived, watching the delivery truck lower it onto the gravel with a hydraulic ramp, and he'd felt something he didn't entirely have a name for. Not envy, exactly. Something older and more complicated. The machine was genuinely impressive, massive and precise, bristling with sensors and screens, smelling of new rubber and fresh paint. It represented a future that Buck understood was real and that he was not part of. He'd nodded at Dale, said she's a beauty, and driven home in his truck without speaking to anyone else. The percolator began to rattle and hiss. Buck poured a mug, took it black, and carried it to the back porch. The cold hit him like a flat hand. 28 degrees, he guessed. Maybe 26. The stars were still visible in the western half of the sky, sharp and white in the February dark. To the east, the gray was deepening into something almost purple. In another 20 minutes, the sun would show itself above the flat line of the horizon and the plains would come back into color. He stood there and drank his coffee and thought about money. The numbers were not good. They hadn't been good in 3 years, and before that they'd only been acceptable. And before that they'd been difficult in the specific and grinding way that small farm finances are always difficult. Not a crisis exactly, but a permanent low-grade pressure, like weather you've stopped noticing because it never changes. The farm had a mortgage, $94,000 remaining, held by Frontier Agricultural Bank out of Wichita. The payment was $1,840 a month, and it had been on time every month for 22 years. Even in the bad years. Even when Buck had worked 3 weeks of harvest labor for neighboring farms to cover it. Even when Margaret was sick and the medical bills from the oncology center in Wichita were stacking up on the kitchen table like an accusation. Margaret had died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 11 months from diagnosis to the end. She had been 54 years old, and she had loved this farm with a ferocity that sometimes embarrassed Buck because he understood that her love for it was purer than his own, less tangled with obligation and inheritance and stubbornness. More simply and honestly devoted to the land and the seasons and the particular life that unfolded here. After she died, he'd almost sold. He'd gotten as far as calling a real estate agent in Coldwater, a woman named Patricia Hollins, who wore blazers and drove a silver Lexus, and who had walked the property with him on a Tuesday afternoon in November, nodding at things and typing notes into her phone. She had told him he could likely get $800,000 for the land, maybe $9 if the market held. He'd thanked her, driven her back to her car, and then gone inside and sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours without moving. He hadn't called her back. The reason wasn't entirely clear to him, even now. Some of it was Margaret, the feeling that selling would be a second loss, a more deliberate one, and that he wasn't ready for that. Some of it was his father's voice, which Buck still heard sometimes in moments of decision, a dry and unhurried Kansas voice that said things like a man who sells his land sells his name. Some of it, if he was honest, was simply that he didn't know what else to do with himself. At 6:15, he climbed up into the cab of the 4250 and turned the key. The engine turned over twice, stumbled, and caught. It ran rough for the first 30 seconds, the idle uneven. A faint knock in the third cylinder that had been there for 2 years and that the mechanic in Greensburg had said was something to watch but not to panic about yet. Then it smoothed out, settling into the low, reliable throb that Buck had been listening to for 3 decades. He sat in the cold cab and let it warm up. The cracked rear window let in a thin line of freezing air that ran along the back of his neck. The instrument panel glowed green in the dimness, temperature, hydraulic pressure, engine hours. The hours counter read 11,847 hours on this engine. He'd done the math once. That was roughly 14 continuous months of running time. The tractor was old. He knew it was old, but it had never in 31 years left him stranded in a field at the wrong moment. He found it difficult to make himself feel bad about that. He pulled out of the shed and rolled slowly down the dirt track toward the south field, the tractor's headlights throwing yellow light across the frozen ground. The winter wheat was barely visible, low green threads emerging from the dark soil. Close planted and deliberately dense, the way his father had always done it and his father's father before that. Dense planting. That was the first thing people always noticed and immediately questioned. You're overcrowding, Buck. You're reducing your yield per plant. He'd heard it 100 times. From neighbors, from county extension agents, from the young agronomist from Kansas State University who had come out 2 summers ago as part of some study on small farm practices and had spent 20 minutes explaining modern plant spacing protocols while standing at the edge of Buck's south field with a clipboard. Buck had listened politely, asked a few questions, and continued doing what he'd always done. The dense planting was part of a system, a rotation and soil management approach that his father, Harold Calloway, had developed over 40 years of farming this same ground. Cover crops between seasons. Deep tilling only every 3rd year, with surface cultivation in between to preserve the microbial layer. Organic matter returned to the soil rather than burned off. A specific rotation sequence, winter wheat, then a summer fallow with legume cover, then grain sorghum, then back to wheat, that Harold had worked out through observation and failure and revision over decades. It wasn't revolutionary. It wasn't proprietary. It was just careful, patient attention to the particular behavior of this specific soil in this specific climate over a long period of time. But it was also deeply unfashionable. The dominant model in Harding County and most of western Kansas really had shifted decisively toward high-input commodity farming, maximum yield per acre, achieved through precision-applied synthetic fertilizers, herbicide-resistant seed varieties, and technology-assisted management. The economics of scale had driven the model, and the economics of scale made sense if you were farming 800 acres or 2,000 acres with borrowed capital and the backing of an agricultural investment firm. On 42 acres, the math was different. On 42 acres with no debt beyond the mortgage and no investors to answer to, a man could farm the way his father had farmed and come out in most years slightly ahead, slightly being the operative word. He was finishing his second pass along the south field's eastern edge when he heard the truck coming up the county road. He knew the sound of it before he could see it, a diesel pickup. Moving fast for the road conditions, gravel pinging against the undercarriage. It slowed and turned into his drive, and Buck climbed down from the tractor cab and stood in the field, waiting. The truck was a black Ford F350, less than a year old, clean despite the season. It pulled up to the edge of the field and the driver's door opened and Thomas Whitfield stepped out. Thomas Whitfield was 41 years old, 6 feet 2 inches tall, and wore a canvas work jacket that had never been near actual work. He was the regional acquisition manager for Consolidated Farmland Partners, a subsidiary of a Phoenix-based investment company called Meridian Asset Group that had, over the past 4 years, acquired approximately 14,000 acres of agricultural land in a 4-county area of southwestern Kansas. He had an easy smile and a firm handshake and the particular kind of confidence that comes not from accomplishment, but from the knowledge that the institution behind you is too large to fail. Buck had met him twice before. Each time Whitfield had made an offer on the Callaway property. Each time Buck had declined. "Morning, Buck." Whitfield came around the hood of the truck and stopped at the edge of the field, looking down at the winter wheat with the expression of a man assessing something he intends to purchase. "Cold one." "It's February," Buck said. Whitfield smiled. "Fair point." He looked at the tractor, then back at Buck. "She's still running?" "You drove 40 minutes to ask about my tractor?" "No." Whitfield reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded document, white paper, dense with text, a blue header at the top. He held it out. "I drove 40 minutes because my company wanted to make sure you received this personally rather than by mail. We consider it a courtesy." Buck didn't reach for the paper. "What is it?" "It's an updated offer. Given current land values in the county, Meridian is prepared to offer $1.1 million for the Callaway property. That's the land, the structures, and all fixed equipment." He paused. "The mobile equipment and personal property would transfer to you, of course, including the tractor." The last two words carried just enough inflection to communicate that keeping the tractor was not being offered as an incentive. Buck looked at the document without touching it. "My answer's the same as the last 2 times, Mr. Whitfield." Whitfield lowered his hand slowly and refolded the document. He didn't seem surprised. He put it back in his pocket and looked out across the field for a long moment. And when he turned back to Buck, the easy smile was still there, but something behind it had shifted slightly. Not to hostility exactly, but to a kind of patient certainty that Buck found more uncomfortable than hostility would have been. "The county assessor has you valued at $680, Whitfield said. "We're offering $1,100. That's a 60% premium, Buck, and it won't always be available at that level. The acquisition phase in this region is winding down. Once we stop buying, the offer goes away." "I understand. The Hendersons took our offer in December, the Birch family in October. Dale Pritchard has an agreement in principle. He'll sign in the spring after his financing clears." Something moved in Buck's chest at that. Dale Pritchard, 800 acres, the new tractor, and now selling to Meridian. He kept his face still. "Good for them," he said. Whitfield studied him for a moment. Then he nodded. Once, with the finality of a man closing a door he expected to reopen. "All right, Buck, you have my number." He got back in the truck and drove away, the gravel crackling under the tires until the sound faded into the flat distance of the plains. Buck stood in the field for a moment after the truck disappeared. The wind had picked up from the northwest, dry and sharp, with the particular edge of open country winter air that found every gap in your clothing and reminded you, specifically and personally, that the plains did not care whether you stayed or went. He climbed back up into the cab of the 4250 and sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel. $1.1 million. He thought about what Margaret would have said. Not the answer he knew the answer or thought he did, but the way she would have said it. She'd been quiet in her opinions, but precise. She would have looked at him from across the kitchen table and said something simple like, "It's your name." Earl, using his full name the way she only did when she meant something exactly. He started the tractor and finished his pass. The town of Millhaven, Kansas had a population of 2,312 people, a grain elevator on the north end of Main Street that was the tallest structure in Hardin County, a diner called Patsy's that had operated continuously since 1958, and a shared understanding of everyone's business that functioned like a community nervous system, slow to transmit good news, extremely efficient with bad. Buck drove his truck into town at 11 o'clock that morning to pick up a hydraulic fitting from the farm supply store on Elm Street. He'd called ahead and the part was waiting at the counter, and the transaction should have taken 4 minutes. It took 22. The farm supply store was run by Gary Meacham, 63, who had operated it for 30 years and who had an opinion on everything and the time to share it. Gary had heard, Buck never found out how, but Gary always heard about Whitfield's visit that morning. "Here you turn down Meridian again," Gary said, handing over the fitting in a small plastic bag. "Yep. One, they're saying." "Yep." Gary leaned on the counter. He was a big man, thick through the chest, with a gray mustache and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. "Buck, I'm not trying to tell you your business, but one is real money." "You could, Gary. I'm just saying I know what you're saying." Gary looked at him for a moment, then shrugged. "All right, that'll be $12.40 for the fitting." Buck paid and left. On the sidewalk outside, he ran into Jim Kowalski, who farmed 300 acres on the east side of the county and who said, unprompted, "Heard you're still fighting Meridian. Stubborn old fool." Not meanly, Jim said most things without meanness, but with the casual certainty of someone who has already decided how a story ends. In Patsy's, where he stopped for a bowl of chili and a piece of cornbread, he overheard 2 men at the counter, Bill Archer and his son-in-law, whose name Buck couldn't remember, talking about the Callaway farm, not to him, not even aware he was in the booth behind them. Just talking the way people talk in small towns about the things that are on everyone's mind. He's gonna lose it to the bank before Meridian ever gets it. At least Meridian would have paid him something. That tractor of his ought to be in a museum. Man's farming like it's 1987. Laughter. The easy, comfortable laughter of people who find other people's stubbornness amusing because they are not the ones bearing its cost. Buck ate his chili and stared at the table and said nothing. He got home at 1 in the afternoon and found his son's car in the driveway. Ryan Callaway was 33 years old, lived in Wichita, and worked in commercial real estate. He was taller than Buck by an inch, with Margaret's coloring, lighter hair, gray eyes, and a neatness about his appearance that always made Buck feel slightly aware of his own work-worn clothes. He was sitting on the back porch steps when Buck came around the side of the house, hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup from a gas station, looking out at the fields. "Didn't know you were coming," Buck said. "Didn't know I was either until this morning." Ryan stood. He looked tired in a way that wasn't just physical, a tension around the eyes and jaw that Buck recognized as worry. "Can we talk inside?" They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where every difficult conversation in this house had ever taken place. Scarred pine worn smooth in the center, a ring stain from Margaret's coffee cup that Buck had never tried to sand out. Ryan put his hands flat on the table. "Dad, I talked to someone at Frontier Bank, one of their loan officers. I know him through a client. He says your account is flagged." Buck said nothing. The November payment was late. The December payment was, Ryan stopped. "Was it late too?" "It's 3 weeks. Jesus, Dad. I made it." "You made it 3 weeks late in December, and I'm guessing January wasn't exactly smooth either." Ryan looked at him with the direct, slightly formal concern of a man who was prepared for this conversation and found it harder than he expected. "How bad is it?" Buck was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands on the table, the knuckles thick, the skin dry and cracked at the fingertips in the way that winter farm work always produced. "The wheat last year came in low," he said. 13% below what I projected. The sorghum did all right, but prices were down. I had the hydraulic pump on the tractor in September, $800. Quote, then the furnace needed the heat exchanger replaced in November. How much do you have in the account right now?" "Enough for February's payment, maybe March if nothing breaks." Ryan sat back in his chair. The look on his face was not quite pity and not quite frustration, something between the two that Buck found harder to take than either. Meridian offered 1-1 this morning, Buck said. Ryan blinked. What? Thomas Whitfield? He came out at 6:30 and I told him no. Ryan stared at him. For a moment he didn't say anything, and Buck could see the effort of control in his face, the deliberate suppression of the response that had leaped immediately to mind. Ryan had always been careful that way. Margaret's boy in that respect. Dad, Ryan said finally, his voice steady and quiet. I need you to help me understand what you're holding on for. Because from where I sit, I see a man with $94,000 in mortgage debt, 2 months away from missing a payment, who just turned down more money than he'll see in the next 10 years of farming. And I love you. I love this place. But I don't understand. Buck looked at his son. He thought about what to say. He thought about his father's voice and Margaret's eyes and the particular quality of this land in March, when the winter wheat came up and the whole south field turned the green of new money. Your grandfather built this from nothing, he said. I know that. He farmed this ground for 50 years. He figured out how it works, this specific ground. That knowledge is in the land now, and it's in me. You can't buy it, and you can't replace it, and if I sell, it's gone. Ryan was quiet. I know that sounds like an old man talking, Buck said. It doesn't, Ryan said, though his voice was complicated. It sounds like you. It sounds exactly like you. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it down. But Dad, if the bank forecloses, you don't get 1-1. You don't get anything. Buck nodded slowly. He knew that. I just need one good season, he said. Ryan looked at him for a long moment. Then he exhaled, a long, controlled breath, and nodded once. Okay, he said. One good season. He stayed for dinner and they didn't talk about the farm again. Buck made the kind of meal he always made: pork chops, green beans from the freezer, cornbread from a mix. They ate at the kitchen table and talked about Ryan's work, about Ryan's apartment in Wichita, about a friend of Ryan's who had recently gotten married. Normal conversation, careful and warm. Two people who loved each other, navigating the distance that had grown between them over years of different lives. After Ryan left, Buck washed the dishes and turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the dark house. One good season. He went to bed at 9 and lay awake until midnight, listening to the wind come down off the plains and test the windows, looking for a way in. March arrived with the particular false promise it always made on the Kansas plains. 3 days of warm sun, the fields softening and the air smelling of mud and possibility, and then a last hard freeze that killed 2 of Buck's neighbors' early plantings and glazed the county. Roads with black ice for a morning. Buck had not planted early. He never did. His father had drilled into him, with the patience of a man who had been wrong about it once himself, that the last killing frost in Harding County came on average on March 24th, and that the smart play was always to wait until the first week of April for the spring plantings, regardless of what the weather seemed to promise in between. The discipline required to watch the ground soften and the calendar say March and still not plant was, Harold Calloway had said, one of the genuine tests of a farmer's character. The freeze killed $3,000 worth of early corn for Jim Kowalski. Buck said nothing about it to anyone. In the second week of March, a woman came to look at the farmhouse. Her name was Carol Simmons, and she worked for Meridian, not in acquisitions like Whitfield, but in what she described as property transition planning, which Buck gathered meant she helped prepare landowners psychologically and practically for the process of selling. She arrived on a Wednesday afternoon without having called first, and Buck met her in the yard with the specific courtesy he extended to strangers who arrived without warning, which was the minimum required by his understanding of hospitality. She was in her mid-40s, well-dressed for a farm visit, with a professional warmth that struck him as genuine but carefully maintained. I'm not here to pressure you, she said, standing in the yard with the farmhouse behind her. Tom Whitfield asked me to stop by simply to introduce myself. Some people find the process easier if they've had a conversation about what it involves before making a decision. I've made a decision, Buck said. I understand. She looked around the property with a different quality of attention than Whitfield had shown, less assessing, more observant. Her eyes moved to the equipment shed, the barn, the south field visible beyond the fence line. How long has the farm been in your family? 61 years. My father bought it in 1965. That's a long time. Yes, it is. She looked at him directly. Mr. Calloway, can I ask you something honestly? Go ahead. What would it take? Not money. I understand money isn't the primary issue for you, but is there something else? A legacy arrangement, maybe? Some kind of agreement about how the land is used after transfer? Meridian has done those in other cases. Buck considered her. He appreciated the directness more than he'd expected to. Miss Simmons, he said, Meridian would plow up my cover crops. Deep till the south field, put in a commercial seed variety under GPS guidance. And in 5 years, the soil biology I've spent 30 years building would be largely gone. There's no legal arrangement that prevents that once I sign the title over. And you know that as well as I do. She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded, with what seemed like genuine acknowledgement. That's a fair assessment, she said. I know it is. She handed him a business card, thanked him for his time, and left. Buck put the card in his shirt pocket and stood in the yard watching her rental car diminish down the county road until it was just a silver glint at the horizon. He thought about what she'd asked. What would it take? He wasn't sure anymore that the answer was anything other than a good harvest. And he wasn't sure if he examined it honestly, that one good harvest was really what he was holding out for. Maybe what he was holding out for was something harder to name, the right to continue. The simple and unreasonable right to remain in the place his father had built on ground that remembered 61 years of careful tending. He went back to work. His daughter called that evening. Sarah Calloway Briggs was 30 years old, lived in Denver, and taught middle school science. She was the most practical person Buck had ever known, including her mother. And she had a way of getting to the center of a thing without preamble that he had always simultaneously admired and found slightly uncomfortable. Ryan called me, she said. I figured, Dad, the bank thing. I know. Do ya? Because Ryan says you're 2 months from missing a payment, one, and that Meridian offered over $1 million and you said no again, and I just need to understand. She stopped. He could hear her steady herself. I need to understand, Dad, because I'm scared. I don't want you to lose the farm to foreclosure. That would be the worst outcome. At least with a sale, you'd have money. You could what? Buck said. What could I do, Sarah? A silence. You could live somewhere comfortable. You could not wake up every morning worrying about money and parts and weather. You could. I could be done, Buck said. Not harshly, stating a fact. Another silence, longer. Is that so terrible? She asked quietly. It was the most honest question either of his children had asked him, and he sat with it for a moment in the kitchen, looking at the window over the sink where Margaret had kept a pot of basil on the sill in summer. I don't know yet, he said. Sarah was quiet. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. I love you, Dad. I love you too, honey. Please don't be too stubborn to ask for help if you need it. After they hung up, Buck sat in the kitchen for a long time. The furnace ran and clicked off and ran again. Outside, the wind moved through the yard, rattling the metal of the equipment shed. And the plains lay dark and vast in every direction, indifferent and eternal. And somewhere under the frozen south field, 40 acres of winter wheat were pushing toward the surface with the blind, determined optimism of things that don't know they can fail. The man who changed things arrived on a Thursday morning in late March. His name was Henry Okafor, and he was 64 years old with a lean build and close-cropped gray hair and the careful, deliberate movements of someone who had learned over decades to be precise with his body. He drove a pickup truck that was old but immaculate, a 2003 Chevy. Dark blue, clean enough that the original paint still had some gloss. He pulled into Buck's drive, got out, and stood for a moment looking at the fields before he came to the door. Buck answered the knock with the wariness he'd developed for unexpected visitors. Mr. Calloway, Okafor said. My name is Henry Okafor. I farm 3 miles east of here. I bought the old Pearson place about 8 months ago. He extended a hand. I've been meaning to introduce myself. I apologize it took this long. Buck shook his hand. The grip was firm and dry. Pearson Place. That's the 40 across from the feedlot. That's right, 37 acres. He paused. I drove past your south field this morning on my way into town. Your winter wheat. What about it? Okafor looked at him with a kind of careful respect. I've been farming for 35 years. Spent 20 of them in the Texas Panhandle, the last 15 up here. I've never seen dense planting done that cleanly on a dryland operation. Who taught you that? Buck studied him for a moment. My father, Okafor nodded slowly. Harold Calloway. I've heard the name. The county extension office has records of your soil test results going back to the 1970s. I looked them up when I bought the Pearson place, trying to understand the ground out here. Your father's organic matter numbers were remarkable. Yours still are. Buck opened the door wider. You want coffee? Henry Okafor had grown up in Nigeria, the son of a subsistence farmer in Enugu State, and had come to the United States at 22 to study agronomy at Texas A&M on a scholarship. He had stayed, married a woman from Lubbock named Patricia, farmed in the Panhandle for 2 decades, and retired from farming for 3 years, before finding that retirement made him restless and unhappy in a way he couldn't fully explain. To people who had never been tied to land. He had bought the Pearson place the previous summer with careful savings and a small inheritance from his wife's family, and he had spent the autumn and winter quietly learning the specific character of the ground and the local climate, walking the fields in all weather the way his father had taught him, reading the county historical records and the soil survey data, and watching his neighbors from a respectful distance. He had been watching Buck's operation with particular attention. "The rotation you're running," he said, sitting across the kitchen table with his coffee, "is almost exactly what I was doing in Palmer County in the 90s. Deep legume cover in the fallow, minimal synthetic input, the dense wheat planting to shade out the early weeds." He looked at Buck. "Most people I've mentioned that to out here look at me like I'm speaking another language. Most people out here are running 800 acres under borrowed money," Buck said. "Yes." Okafor wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. "Which is why I find your operation interesting, Mr. Calloway. And why I wanted to talk to you." "About what?" "About this summer." He looked out the kitchen window at the south field. "I've been reading the climate models for the region. The NOAA seasonal forecast. The drought monitor projections." He turned back. "This summer is going to be very dry." Buck said nothing. He'd been reading the same forecasts. "I think we're looking at a drought event," Okafor said. "Possibly significant. The soil moisture going into spring is already below the 30-year average for Harding County. If the La Nina pattern holds the way the models are suggesting," he stopped. "How deep is your water holding capacity in the south field?" 8-9 inches in the top 2 feet on average. Better in the northwest corner. The organic matter there is about 6%. I've been building it for 15 years. Okafor was quiet for a moment, and the look on his face was the look of someone doing mental arithmetic about things that matter. 6% organic matter, he said. "That holds roughly 2.5 times the water that a depleted soil does." "I know. Conventional operations in this county are running 1.5% organic matter." He paused. "In a serious drought, Mr. Calloway, the difference between your ground and theirs is the difference between a crop and a disaster." The kitchen was quiet, the furnace ran. Outside, the March wind pushed along the eaves of the house. "I had an idea," Okafor said. "A proposal, really. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to hear it." Buck looked at him for a long moment. There was something about this man, the precision of his speech, the depth of his attention, the way he looked at the land, that made Buck feel the unfamiliar experience of being genuinely understood by someone he'd just met. "Go ahead," he said. The proposal was straightforward, a cooperative arrangement between the 2 farms for the coming season. Okafor had the agronomic knowledge and the time. Buck had the deeper soil capital and the equipment. Okafor wanted to trial a specific variety of drought-tolerant grain sorghum, a variety he'd worked with in the Texas Panhandle under dry conditions on both properties, managed with the soil preservation techniques both men already practiced. The costs would be shared. So would the revenue. "I don't have much capital to bring in," Buck said. "You have 42 acres of some of the best managed ground in Harding County," Okafor said. "That's the capital." They talked for 2 hours. When Okafor left, Buck stood in the yard and watched the blue pickup roll down the drive, and he felt something that had been absent from his mornings for quite a while. Something like possibility. By the middle of June, the forecasts had proven conservative. The rain had stopped in early May. The last meaningful rainfall, 0.7 of an inch over a Tuesday and Wednesday, had come on May 8th and 9th. And since then, the sky over Harding County had been a relentless pale blue, the sun working from horizon to horizon in a dry, grinding arc that baked the clay roads to powder and cracked the topsoil on unprotected fields into patterns that looked like the scales of something ancient. The temperature hit 104 degrees Fahrenheit on June 19th. On June 21st, it reached 108 degrees Fahrenheit, and the County Emergency Management Office issued a heat advisory, and 2 elderly residents in Millhaven were hospitalized. The corn was the first to show the damage. Jim Kowalski's field, the one where the early freeze had already killed his first planting back in March, which he'd replanted in April, began to roll its leaves by the 2nd week of June. Leaf rolling was the plant's emergency response to heat and water stress. Curling to reduce the surface area exposed to evaporation. It was the crop's way of telling you it was in trouble. By late June, Kowalski's corn was silking under severe stress, and the ear development was compromised. He was looking at 30 to 40% yield loss at minimum. He was not alone. Across the county, the story was variations of the same. The spring wheat was burning at the edges. The early soybean fields on the flat ground near the river bottom were wilting by afternoon. The operations with high yield, low organic matter soil, the majority of the commercial operations, the ones that had been maximum production farming for 20 or 30 years under high synthetic fertilizer load, were suffering the most, because their ground, whatever its productivity under normal conditions, could not hold water. And they needed water. They needed it badly. The irrigation wells were running, but the aquifer levels in the county had been declining for a decade, and pumping costs in the heat had the meters spinning. Dale Pritchard's operation, 800 acres, the new GPS tractor, the Agravance capital financing, had 3 center pivot irrigation systems running 20 hours a day. Buck drove past it one morning in late June and watched the pivots moving slowly across the corn, the spray catching the morning light in brief rainbows, and he thought about the pumping costs, the electricity, the stress on the aquifer, and the payment on the $400,000-$20,000 tractor waiting at the end of every month, regardless of yield. Buck's South Field was not unaffected. This needed to be stated clearly because there was no version of a summer this brutal that left any crop untouched. The wheat had come off in early June at about 90% of his projected yield, down, but not disastrously. The sorghum that he and Henry Okafor had planted in May was showing stress by late June, the leaves darkening at the midribs in the afternoons, the plants pulling moisture from deeper in the profile. But it was pulling moisture. That was the point. The ground had moisture to give. Henry walked Buck's South Field with him on a late June morning, both men moving slowly down the rows in the 7 a.m. heat, already 91 degrees Fahrenheit at 7, examining the plants with the close attention of people reading a language written in leaves and soil color. "Look at the color at the base," Henry said, crouching at a plant, pinching the soil between his fingers. He held it up. "It's still cohesive. It's still binding. You've got moisture down there." He moved to the edge of the field and crouched again, looking across the row tops. "Dale's field. You can see it from here." He pointed north across the fence line, to where Pritchard's corn was visible in the distance. The leaves rolled tight against the morning heat. "His field looks like straw." "He's irrigating constantly," Buck said. "He's chasing it," Henry said, standing. "His ground can't hold the water long enough. He puts it on, it evaporates or percolates through, and 24 hours later the plants are stressed again." He looked at Buck's sorghum. "Your ground will hold. You may lose some yield on the south corner where the organic matter is thinner, but the northwest section," he shook his head slightly, with the expression of someone seeing something that continues to impress them, "that northwest section might give you a full yield." Buck stood in the row and looked out at his field. The sorghum was waist-high, deep green in the morning light, holding on with a stubbornness that he recognized in some distant and not entirely rational part of himself. As a quality of the ground itself, the memory of 61 years of careful tending, expressed now as the capacity to survive what was trying to kill everything else. "I need this to work," Henry, Buck said. "I know." Henry stood beside him in the row. "It's going to work. Word travels in a small county." By mid-July, it was common knowledge in Millhaven that the Callaway Place and the Okafor Place, the 2 smallest operations in the area, the 2 that had been most consistently underestimated, were the ones still carrying a green crop. The knowledge traveled the way uncomfortable truths travel in small communities, sideways, in fragments, accompanied by qualifications and alternative explanations. "Well, he doesn't have enough acres to really be affected. The Okafor Places is different ground then, sure, but what kind of yield is he actually going to see?" Buck heard the conversations. He heard them at Patsy's and at the farm supply store and in the parking lot of the grain elevator. He said nothing in response to any of them. What he was watching with more attention than the gossip was Dale Pritchard. Pritchard had stopped farming 800 acres the way an 800-acre operation should run. He was triaging, focusing the irrigation on the fields closest to the road, the ones visible, and letting the back sections go. Buck had driven past and seen the difference, the near fields still showing green under the pivot spray, the back 40-acre sections going brown and still. He'd also heard through Gary Meacham at the farm supply store, who heard everything, that Pritchard had missed a payment to Agravance Capital in June, and that the agreement in principle with Meridian had stalled. Pritchard's land, with damaged crops and demonstrated water vulnerability, was not worth to Meridian what it had been worth in February. The economics of scale worked in your favor until the moment they worked violently against you. The moment things changed publicly came on a Friday afternoon in late July. Buck was in town at the grain elevator running a sample of his early sorghum harvest, a small test cut from the northwest section, 40 days before the full harvest, just to get a read on the numbers. The elevator manager, a quiet man named Phil Decker, ran the moisture and protein analysis while Buck waited, and when the results came back, Decker looked at them and then looked at Buck and said nothing for a moment. "These are good numbers, Buck. How good?" Decker put the paper on the counter between them. Buck looked at the moisture percentage, the test weight, the protein content. He kept his expression still, but something moved in his chest. "Under these drought conditions," Decker said carefully, "these are exceptional numbers." There were two other men in the elevator office. Buck didn't know one of them. The other was Bill Archer, who had been in Patsy's back in February when someone had said the tractor ought to be in a museum. Archer looked at the numbers on the paper. He looked at Buck, he opened his mouth and then closed it. Buck picked up the paper, folded it, and put it in his shirt pocket. "Thanks, Phil," he said, and walked out. Thomas Whitfield called the following Monday. "I hear your sorghum is coming in well," Whitfield said. "Crops are crops," Buck said. Buck a pause. "I want to be straightforward with you. Meridian is reassessing its position in the county. The drought has complicated some of our holdings. The Pritchard acquisition is likely not going to proceed." Buck waited. "Your property," Whitfield said, "has performed in a way that frankly surprised our analysts. The soil profile, we had agronomists look at the county survey data after the drought started, and your organic matter numbers are..." Another pause. "They're anomalous for this region. My father built that soil," Buck said. 60 years of building it." "I understand that now in a way I didn't before," Whitfield said, and Buck believed he meant it. "I'm not calling to make another offer, Buck. He seemed to choose his words. I wanted to tell you that from a professional standpoint, what you've maintained there is genuinely remarkable, and I wanted you to know that we know that." Buck sat with that for a moment. "I appreciate you saying so," he said. After he hung up, he sat in the kitchen and looked out the window at the south field, where the sorghum stood tall and green in the dry heat, doing what good ground does when you have tended it with enough patience and care, holding on when everything else lets go. August in Kansas was a punishment and a harvest at the same time. The heat did not break. The temperature stayed above 100 degrees Fahrenheit for 11 consecutive days in the first 2 weeks of the month. And the soil in the county, what remained of it in any viable condition, was pulled down to its last reserves. The county's dryland crop losses were being estimated at 40 to 60% of normal yield. The irrigation operations had run their costs so high that several farmers were already calculating whether their revenue would cover their pumping bills. Buck and Henry cut the northwest section of the south field on August 9th. The yield was not a miracle. Buck had stopped expecting miracles sometime in his mid-30s, and a man who farms dry land in Kansas and still expects miracles is a man who has not been paying attention. But the yield from the northwest section, the 6% organic matter ground, the ground his father had started building in 1968 with a cover crop rotation he'd read about in an agricultural journal and modified over 20 years of observation, was 91% of his projected normal harvest. In the context of what was happening across Harding County that summer, 91% of normal might as well have been miraculous. The south corner came in at 64%. The east section, where the organic matter was thinner and the water holding capacity shallower, hit 72, combined with Henry's yield from the Pearson place, which ran lower on average but still above county norms. The cooperative harvest for the season was better than either man had projected under drought conditions. Buck stood at the edge of the cut northwest section on the evening of August 9th, after the combine had finished and Henry had gone home, and looked at the stubble in the fading light. The air smelled of cut grain and dry earth and the faint mineral sharpness that the Kansas plains give off at evening in summer. The horizon was a long line of orange and purple, and somewhere in the west a line of clouds was building, not rain yet, maybe not rain for another week, but the suggestion that the sky still had moisture in it somewhere, and had not entirely forgotten how to give it back. He thought about his father. Harold Calloway had died in 2009, at 78, in the bedroom that Buck now slept in. He had farmed this ground for 44 years and left it better than he'd found it. Richer, more complex, more capable of weathering the things that weather cannot control. That was the inheritance. Not the land itself, not the structures, but the system of understanding embedded in the soil, a kind of agricultural knowledge made physical, expressed now in organic matter percentages and water holding capacity and the health of the microbial community in the top 2 feet of the profile. You could not buy that. You could not acquire it in a transaction or recreate it in 5 years or 10 years or possibly ever, once it was gone. Buck bent down and picked up a handful of the harvested soil. He turned it over in his palm, feeling the weight and texture of it, the way it held together in a cohesive mass rather than sifting away to dry powder. After 60 years of care, it had the quality of something alive, dark and dense and complex, smelling of things in the process of becoming. He opened his hand and let it fall back to the ground. The complications began in the second week of August. The Frontier Agricultural Bank sent a letter. Formal letterhead, the language careful and procedural, the meaning clear. The account was considered at elevated risk of default. The August payment had been made. Buck had made it with the advance on the grain sale, but the 2 late payments in the winter quarter had triggered a review. The bank was requesting a meeting to discuss the account status and the terms of the existing mortgage. Buck called Ryan. "I need you to come with me," he said. Ryan was quiet for a moment. "When?" "They want to meet next Thursday, Wichita." "Okay." A pause. "Dad, how does the harvest look?" "Better than I expected." "Better how?" "Good enough that I think I can make the case for keeping the mortgages." Buck paused. "I just don't want to walk into a bank meeting alone. I'm not good at those." "I'll be there," Ryan said. The meeting at Frontier Agricultural Bank was in a conference room on the 4th floor of an office building in downtown Wichita. The bank's representative was a loan officer named Craig Hollenbeck, mid-40s, pleasant, with the measured professional manner of someone delivering bad news with the least possible friction. Buck sat across the table with Ryan beside him. Henry Okafor had offered to come and Buck had accepted. Henry's numbers helped. And having someone who could speak the agronomic language with precision mattered in a room like this. Hollenbeck laid out the situation clearly. The late payments had created a technical default condition under the mortgage terms. The bank had the contractual right to accelerate the debt, to call the remaining balance due immediately. They were not exercising that right today, but they needed to understand the account holder's ability to bring the account current and maintain it going forward. Ryan had prepared a document. He'd spent the previous weekend with Buck's records, assembling 3 years of income and expense data, the harvest projections, the cooperative arrangement with Henry, the soil assessment data that showed the comparative drought performance of the Callaway ground against the county average. He laid it on the table and walked Hollenbeck through it with the precise, calm professionalism that Buck had watched his son develop over years of working in commercial real estate. Buck sat and watched his son make the case for this farm and felt something in his chest that he didn't try to name. Henry provided the agronomic context, the organic matter numbers, the water holding capacity, the performance data from the summer, the soil survey comparison showing the Callaway ground's anomalous quality within the county. He spoke with the authority of someone who understood the subject completely and had nothing to prove. Hollenbeck listened, asked questions. He took notes. At the end of the meeting, he told them that the bank would not accelerate the debt, that he would recommend to the loan committee that the account be restructured with a 6-month payment deferral, the deferred amount added to the end of the mortgage term, to allow the harvest revenue to fully clear and the account to return to current standing. It was not a victory exactly, it was a reprieve. But it was a reprieve that the farm had earned, and that was not nothing. In the elevator going down, Ryan stood beside Buck and looked straight ahead at the elevator doors. And Buck could see his son working through the emotion of the last 2 hours. The relief, the residual fear, the particular complicated feeling of watching your father nearly lose what he has spent his life protecting. "You okay?" Buck asked. "Yeah," Ryan said. Then, he didn't know anything about farming until Henry started talking. You could see it on his face. He had no idea what organic matter was or why it mattered. A pause, and then Henry explained what your ground did this summer compared to the county average, and Hollenbeck Ryan shook his head. He got it. Henry's good at explaining things, Buck said. You built that soil, Dad. The elevator opened into the lobby. They walked out into the August heat of Wichita, and Buck put his hand briefly on his son's shoulder. And Ryan reached up and gripped it for a moment, and they stood like that in the sun for a few seconds before they walked to their cars. The harder conversation came that evening. Buck was back home, the day's paperwork spread on the kitchen table, when Dale Pritchard's truck pulled into the drive. He hadn't spoken to Pritchard since early spring. They'd been neighbors for 20 years, not close exactly, but the kind of neighbors that farming communities produce, bound by proximity and shared weather and the unspoken understanding that the land doesn't care about personal differences. Pritchard looked tired. He was 51 years old and had always carried himself with the confidence of a man whose operation was the most visible in the county, but tonight he looked like someone who had been awake for several consecutive weeks. He stood in the yard and Buck came out to meet him, and they stood in the evening heat with the sound of the equipment shed's tin roof ticking as it cooled. Heard your sorghum came in well, Pritchard said. Well enough. Pritchard looked at the south field. The stubble was still visible in the evening light. He was quiet for a long moment. Agravance called my loan, Pritchard said. The missed payment in June triggered the acceleration clause. He said it flatly, the way someone states a fact they are still in the process of accepting. They're not foreclosing immediately. But the terms are, I need to make up the payment plus penalty by October or they begin proceedings. Buck said nothing. He waited. Meridian pulled back, Pritchard said. After the drought, after the yield data came in, my ground doesn't look the same to them as it did in February. He paused. They're offering $680 now. County assessed value. No premium, Buck exhaled slowly through his nose. Dale, he said carefully, I'm sorry. Pritchard looked at him. There was no hostility in it, just the exhausted honesty of a man who had run out of positions to defend. You tried to tell me, not in so many words, but I knew what you thought about the way I was farming, the inputs, the debt load. He shook his head. I thought the technology would carry it. The technology is good, Buck said. It's what's under the technology that matters. Pritchard was quiet for a moment. How'd you do it? The soil, I mean. My grandfather farmed that ground before me and it was decent ground. 30 years of commodity production and it's... He stopped. It doesn't happen fast, Buck said. And it doesn't come back fast either. He looked at the south field. My father used to say that the soil is the farmer's balance sheet. You can spend it down for years and the income statement looks fine. Then one bad season and the whole thing comes due. Pritchard nodded slowly. He seemed to be deciding something. I want to learn, he said. If I keep the land, and I don't know yet if I can, I want to understand what you're doing, what your father did. I've got 800 acres that are in worse shape than I let myself know, and I've got a debt load I can't carry another bad year, and... He stopped himself. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking if you'd be willing to talk. About the rotation, about the cover crops, about what it actually takes. Buck looked at his neighbor. He thought about 20 years of the man's easy confidence, his expensive equipment, his assumption that scale and technology could substitute for the patient, unglamorous work of building soil. Quote. He thought about the contempt, never vicious but steady, that Pritchard had directed at the 4,250, at the modest acreage, at the old-fashioned methods. And he thought about what his father had said once at the kitchen table, about a neighbor who had made similar mistakes in a dry summer 30 years ago. A man who's willing to learn is worth more than a man who already knows everything. Come by Saturday morning, Buck said. Bring coffee. Pritchard nodded. Something in his face shifted. Relief, or something close to it, mixed with the particular humility of a proud man who has found his way to the right question too late and knows it. Thank you, Buck, he said. He drove away and Buck stood in the yard in the cooling evening air and watched the last light fade off the stubble of the south field. The letter from the Kansas State University Extension Office arrived on a Thursday. It was addressed to both Earl Calloway and Henry Okafor, which surprised Buck. Though it shouldn't have, Henry had been quietly in contact with the Extension Office since spring, sharing his soil data and the cooperative arrangements methodology. The letter was from a Dr. Patricia Wren, who ran the Dryland Agriculture Research Program at K-State. And it was an invitation to participate in a case study on drought-resilient soil management practices in southwestern Kansas. Henry called that evening, clearly pleased. It's good exposure, Buck, he said. For the methodology, for what your father built, it gets documented. It gets into the literature. I don't need to be in any literature, Buck said. Maybe not. But someone else's son, 40 years from now, might need to read about what a man did in 2026 in Harding County to keep his crop alive in a drought. A pause. Think about that. Buck thought about it. He called Dr. Wren the next morning and told her yes, September came in with rain. Not dramatic rain, not the biblical deliverance of a Hollywood story, not a thunderstorm rolling across the plains in a wall of light and sound. Just steady, ordinary Kansas rain. Beginning on a Tuesday night and continuing through Wednesday, leaving 7/10 of an inch in the gauge by Thursday morning. Then another half-inch the following week. Then the temperatures dropped into the 80s, and the sky took on the particular pale blue clarity of early fall on the plains. And the terrible summer began, finally, to release its grip. The county damage assessments came out in mid-September. Harding County had experienced its worst growing season in 41 years. Total crop loss estimates across the county were at 53% of normal yield value. The hardest hit operations were the high-input commodity farms with depleted organic matter soil profiles. 11 farms in the county had filed for or were expected to file for some form of financial restructuring. 3 had already entered foreclosure proceedings. The Consolidated Farmland Partners holdings in the county had sustained losses estimated at $22 million in crop value. Their publicly filed quarterly report noted unexpected performance degradation across acquired dryland properties in southwestern Kansas due to severe drought conditions. Thomas Whitfield had not called back. Dale Pritchard had come on Saturday morning as promised with 2 large coffees from the gas station in Millhaven, and he had sat at Buck's kitchen table while Buck and Henry walked him through the rotation system. The cover crop sequencing, the organic matter building protocol, the long timeline required to restore what had been depleted. Pritchard had listened with the complete uncomfortable attention of a man dismantling his own assumptions in real time. He had asked good questions. He had come back the following Saturday, and the one after that he had not saved his operation yet. That was a long road, and Pritchard knew it now in a way he hadn't known it in February. But he was on it. Buck drove to Wichita on the last Friday of September to have dinner with Ryan and Sarah. Sarah had flown in from Denver, a surprise that Ryan had organized, and that Buck discovered only when he walked into Ryan's apartment and found his daughter sitting on the couch. She stood up and hugged him with the fierce, specific grip she'd had since she was 7 years old, and Buck held on for a moment longer than usual. They went to a restaurant near Ryan's apartment, a place with good food and quiet enough to talk, and sat around a table and ordered too much and ate slowly and talked about everything and nothing for 2 hours. Ryan had brought a bottle of wine that he said was appropriate for the occasion, though he was evasive about which occasion exactly they were marking. Halfway through the meal, Sarah put her fork down and looked at him. "Tell me how you feel," she said. Buck considered the question. It was the kind of question he was not naturally equipped to answer with speed or completeness, and Sarah knew that and was asking it anyway. "Relieved," he said after a moment. "That's it? Tired?" Relieved and tired. He looked at his plate and then at his daughter. "Grateful. For what specifically?" "For the ground holding," he said. "For Henry. For the 2 of you." He looked at Ryan, then back at Sarah. "For your grandfather, I guess. For what he built." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "I was so scared you were going to lose it," she said. "I know, and I'm sorry I pushed you to sell. I didn't understand what it was, not really. I thought I did, but..." She shook her head. "After the drought data came out and Ryan explained the soil thing to me, I started to understand what Grandpa actually built there, what you've maintained." Her voice was steady, but just barely. "It's not just a farm, is it?" "No," Buck said. "It's not just a farm." Ryan refilled the wine glasses. He raised his. "To Harold Calloway," he said. Buck looked at his son. Ryan had Margaret's eyes, gray and direct, and in this light he looked like the person he had always been becoming, capable and careful, and underneath the competence, still the boy who had ridden on the 4,250 at age 6 and fallen asleep against Buck's arm in the cab, rocking gently over the field rows in the autumn afternoon. Buck raised his glass. "To Harold Calloway," he said. They drank. On the first Saturday of October, Dr. Patricia Wren and 2 graduate students from K-State came out to the farm. Dr. Wren was 52, with short gray hair and the direct, enthusiastic manner of someone who became an agricultural scientist. because she genuinely loved soil and had never stopped. She walked Buck's south field with the kind of attention that Buck recognized as real, not the performance of expertise, but the actual close observation of someone reading something they care about. She took samples at 6 points across the field. She asked Buck to walk her through the rotation history year by year, and she wrote in her notebook continuously, stopping to ask precise questions about timing and quantities and the specific modifications Buck had made to his father's system over the years. At the northwest corner, the 6% organic matter section, the section that had carried a full yield through the worst drought in 40 years, she crouched in the soil and worked a handful of it between her fingers, and looked up at Buck. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "this is one of the finest examples of dryland soil stewardship I've seen in the southern plains, in a research context." Buck stood at the edge of his father's ground and looked out at the stubble of the harvested field, at the cover crop he'd seeded 2 weeks ago already showing its first green, at the flat horizon of the Kansas plains extending to every edge of the sky. "My father built it," he said. "You maintained it," she said, "for 30 years. Under real economic pressure, when every incentive in the market was telling you to do something different." She stood. "Do you understand how rare that is?" He thought about that for a moment. About the mornings in the cold cab of the 4250, watching the sun come up over the flat country. About the late payments and the tight winters and the laughter in Patsy's and Whitfield's truck in the drive at 6:30 in the morning. About Dale Pritchard's face in the yard, stripped of its confidence, asking to learn. About Margaret's basil on the kitchen windowsill. About what it meant to hold on to something that the world kept offering you good reasons to release. "I'm starting to," he said. The harvest accounting was finalized in mid-October. With the cooperative arrangement and the drought premium pricing on grain, the market, as it always does in scarcity years, had driven sorghum prices significantly above normal. The season's revenue was, against all reasonable expectation, the best Buck had seen in 7 years. Not enough to pay off the mortgage. Not enough to retire the anxiety entirely, but enough. Enough to bring the bank account current. Enough to fund the cover crop and the winter inputs. Enough to carry into spring with something in reserve for the first time in 3 years. He called Ryan on the evening the numbers were final. "It worked," he said. Ryan was quiet for a moment. "How does it look?" Buck told him the numbers. Another silence. And then Ryan said something he hadn't said to Buck since he was a teenager, something that came out rough and genuine, with the particular awkwardness of a man expressing emotion he has long kept professional. "I'm really proud of you, Dad." Buck sat in the kitchen at the scarred pine table, in the house his father had built, on the ground his father had begun and Buck had continued, and felt the full weight of that sentence settle over him the way good soil settles, densely with substance, with the promise of something living. "Thank you, son," he said. November brought the cold back and the fields went quiet under their cover crops, the ground resting and building in the way it always did through winter, unseen, unhurried, accumulating. Buck woke at 4:47 a.m. On the first Monday of November, same as always. He lay in the dark and looked at the water stain on the ceiling. Nebraska, or close enough, and listened to the silence of the plains. His left knee announced itself. His lower back registered its position. He swung his legs off the bed, crossed to the window, and looked out at the yard. The fields were dark, the cover crops invisible in the pre-dawn. The equipment shed a low shape against the slightly lighter sky. The 4250 was in there, where it always was. 11,860 some hours on the engine. The cracked rear window, the rust at the wheel wells, the left front tire that was newer than everything else. Quote. He stood there for a moment, looking at it. He'd been offered by a farm equipment dealer in Greensburg who'd heard about the K-State study and the drought performance and the suddenly improved economics of the Callaway operation, a trade and deal on a newer machine. Not new, but a 2015 model with a third of the hours, a sealed cab, functioning heat. He'd thanked the dealer and said he'd think about it. Standing at the window in the dark, he thought about it. The 4250 had 11,847 hours and had never left him in a field. His father had bought it. It smelled of oil and age and use. In 31 years it had turned the ground of this farm in every season, in every weather, and the ground had responded year by year. with the slow accumulating richness that was the only real measure of whether a farmer had done his work. There was an argument, he supposed, for the newer machine: practicality, reliability going forward. The cold cab was hard on his back in February. He thought about it for another minute. Then he went downstairs, put the percolator on, and pulled on his boots. Some things you didn't trade away? He went out into the cold dark, crossed the yard, and climbed up into the cab with the 4250. The engine turned over twice, stumbled, and caught. It ran rough for the first 30 seconds, then smoothed into its familiar, low, reliable rhythm. Buck sat in the cold cab and let it warm up and watched the horizon to the east begin its slow preparation, the gray deepening, the dark lifting, the flat line of the Kansas plains emerging from the night the way it always did. Unhurried and immense. The same ground that had been there before him, and would be there long after. Patient and deep and holding everything it had ever been given. The sun came up. He drove out to the south field, and the cover crop caught the first light, low and green and already growing, already building, already becoming the thing it would be by spring. Earl Buck Calloway, 58 years old, the last small farmer in a county full of corporate land, drove his 1987 John Deere 4250 down the row in the November dawn and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the ground and the man were exactly where they were supposed to be.